No good deed goes unpunished. Claire Booth Luce, they say no good deed goes unpunished. For a retired fire chief on a Georgia highway, that punishment came with handcuffs and a jail cell. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices to light. Like and follow for more true stories of courage and injustice. The afternoon sun blazed over Pike County, Georgia, turning the asphalt into ribbons of heat. Rick Rickerson's hands gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup, the leather worn smooth from decades of use. 32 years. That's how long he'd been driving to emergencies. 32 years of racing toward danger while everyone else ran away. But those days were behind him now. Retirement meant slow drives, quiet afternoons, and evenings spent on the porch watching the sun go down. The radio played a country song about heartbreak and whiskey. Rick wasn't really listening. His mind wandered to dinner plans, maybe grilling some chicken, catching the Braves game on TV. Highway 18 stretched ahead, familiar and unremarkable. He'd driven this road 1,000 times. Nothing ever happened out here. Just fields, barbed wire fences, and the occasional deer. Then he saw the smoke, not the lazy white drift of a backyard barbecue. Not the controlled burn of a farmer clearing brush. This was black smoke, thick, urgent, rising from somewhere just beyond the curve ahead like a distress signal from hell itself. Rick's foot instinctively pressed the accelerator. The engine roared to life. His heart kicked into that old familiar rhythm, the one that had powered him through 3 decades of emergency calls. Something was very wrong. The curve opened up, and there it was. A silver sedan lay on its roof in the ditch, crumpled like a crushed soda can. The front end was obliterated. The windshield had exploded into a spider web of shattered glass. Metal groaned and hissed. The acrid smell of gasoline filled the air, mixing with the black smoke curling from the engine block. Debris littered the road, chunks of plastic, twisted metal, broken glass glittering in the afternoon sun. And no one had stopped. The highway was empty except for the wreckage. But what Rick didn't know was that stopping to help would turn him into a criminal in the eyes of the law. Rick slammed his truck into park and killed the engine. He was out the door before the vehicle stopped rocking, his boots hitting the gravel at a run. Every instinct from 3 decades of emergency response kicked in. The fuel leak, the smoke, the possibility of fire or explosion. None of it mattered. Someone was trapped in that car. He dropped to his knees beside the driver's side window, broken glass crunching under his weight. Through the shattered opening, he could see her. A young woman, maybe late 20s, with blonde hair matted with blood. Her arms hung limp, dangling toward the roof. She was suspended upside down by her seatbelt, unconscious, unmoving. Rick reached through the window. His fingers found her neck, searching for a pulse. There, faint, thready, barely there. She was alive but in critical condition. Her airway was compromised. Blood pooled in her mouth. If he didn't act fast, she would drown in her own blood before help arrived. By now 2 other vehicles had pulled over. A middle-aged man with shaking hands stumbled toward the wreck, his face pale. A younger woman stood by her car, phone pressed to her ear, already calling 911. Rick barked orders, his voice sharp and clear, the command voice he'd used for 32 years. The older man helped him pry at the jammed door. Metal screamed in protest, but finally gave way with a grinding crunch. Carefully, they eased the woman out of the vehicle. Supporting her head, protecting her neck, every movement deliberate and controlled. Rick had seen enough trauma cases to know that internal injuries could be killing her even as they worked to save her. Time was running out. He tilted her head back, clearing her airway. Blood drained from her mouth. He checked for breathing. Nothing. Her chest wasn't moving. Her lips were turning blue. She was dying right in front of him. Rick didn't hesitate. His hands positioned on her sternum. He began CPR to 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The rhythm was burned into his muscle memory from 1,000 training sessions and 100 real-world saves. His hands pressed down hard and fast, forcing oxygen-depleted blood through her body. He tilted her head back and gave rescue breaths, watching desperately for her chest to rise. 1 minute passed. Then 2, his arms burned with the effort. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes. The bystanders stood frozen, watching, their phones recording everything. The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled from the younger woman's phone, asking for updates. Then, a violent cough, the woman's body convulsed. Blood sprayed from her mouth. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air. Shallow, ragged breaths, but breaths nonetheless. She was alive. Rick rolled her into the recovery position, monitoring her pulse, keeping her airway clear. Relief flooded through him, but he didn't relax. She was alive, yes, but still critical. Every second without advanced medical care pushed her closer to the edge. Where was the ambulance? Where was the helicopter? Behind him, tires crunched on gravel. A car door slammed. The distinctive chirp of a police radio broke through the afternoon heat. Rick glanced back, expecting assistance. Instead, he got Officer Thomas Brown of the Georgia State Patrol. Brown stepped out of his cruiser, his face an expressionless mask. He surveyed the scene with cold efficiency. The overturned car, the debris field, the woman on the ground, and Rick's pickup truck, parked diagonally across the right lane, blocking the flow of traffic that hadn't yet arrived. Brown approached, his hand resting on his belt. Not on his weapon, but close enough to be noticed. "You need to move that truck," Brown said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "It's obstructing the roadway." Rick looked up from the woman. Blood still trickled from the corner of her mouth. Her breathing remained shallow and irregular. He couldn't leave her, not now. Not when she was this unstable. "I can't move it right now, officer," Rick replied, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "This woman is critical. If I leave her unattended, she could die." Brown's expression didn't change. "So your vehicle is blocking traffic. I'm ordering you to move it immediately." Rick stayed where he was, one hand on the woman's shoulder, the other monitoring her pulse at her neck. He'd been in tense situations before. Fires on the verge of explosion. Buildings about to collapse. Active shooter scenarios during training. He knew how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't about danger. This was about common sense. And Officer Brown seemed to be operating from a different playbook entirely. "Officer, I'm a retired fire battalion chief," Rick said, his tone still respectful but firm. "I've been doing this for 32 years. This patient needs continuous monitoring until EMS arrives. If I leave her, she could aspirate blood, have a seizure, or go into cardiac arrest. I'm not moving until paramedics take over." The two men stared at each other. The absurdity of the moment hung in the air like the gasoline fumes from the wreck. A woman lay dying on the ground. A trained emergency responder was keeping her alive. And a state trooper was demanding that he abandon her to move a truck, and then everything changed. "Turn around," Brown said, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "Hands behind your back." Rick blinked, not comprehending. "What?" "You're under arrest for obstruction of a law enforcement officer." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in Rick's ears. Cold steel bit into his wrists as Brown secured them tightly. Around them, the bystanders stood in shocked silence. One of them started to protest, but Brown ignored them. He recited the Miranda rights in a mechanical monotone, the words washing over Rick like water. Rick looked down at the woman on the ground. Another bystander had knelt beside her, trying to keep her stable, but they clearly didn't know what they were doing. They were just trying their best. Rick wanted to tell them what to watch for, how to position her airway, but the words caught in his throat. Minutes later, the helicopter ambulance arrived. The rotor wash kicked up a storm of dust and debris. Paramedics in flight suits rushed to the woman, working quickly and efficiently to stabilize her for transport. She was loaded into the helicopter, and within seconds, the aircraft lifted off, banking toward the nearest trauma center. 7 hours of emergency surgery awaited her. Doctors would later testify that without immediate CPR, she would have died at the scene. But Rick wouldn't learn that for days. Instead, he was placed in the back of Officer Brown's patrol car and driven to the Pike County Jail. No one could believe it. The man who saved a life was sitting in a cell. The woman he saved was fighting for hers on an operating table. And somewhere in the machinery of justice, something had gone horribly, terribly wrong. The Pike County Jail was a small facility, the kind where deputies knew everyone who came through the doors. When they processed Rick, fingerprints, mugshot, personal belongings confiscated and catalogued, they didn't know what to make of it. A retired fire chief? Arrested for obstruction? While performing CPR on a dying woman? It didn't compute. Rick sat in the holding cell, still wearing his jeans and flannel shirt, both stained with blood and reeking of gasoline. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, another inmate was shouting about his phone call. Rick barely heard any of it. His mind kept replaying the scene. The woman's face, the blood in her mouth, the moment she started breathing again. Had he done something wrong? Could he have handled it differently? No. Every instinct, every bit of training, every lesson learned over 3 decades told him the same thing. You never, ever leave a critical patient unattended. Never. The truck could have waited. The road could have been blocked for another 5 minutes. But that woman's life couldn't wait. She was dying. And he'd saved her. But apparently the law saw things differently. Hours later, Rick was released on bond. His wife picked him up from the jail, her face pale and drawn with worry. The story had already started to spread through Pike County. In a small town, news traveled at the speed of light, and bad news traveled even faster. "They arrested you," she said, her voice trembling. "For saving someone's life." Rick nodded, too exhausted to explain. "For obstruction." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "That's insane." "I know, but knowing didn't change anything." Rick now faced criminal charges. If convicted, he could spend up to a year in jail. His reputation, built over 3 decades of service, hundreds of lives saved, countless commendations and awards, was now tainted. People would always wonder, was there more to the story? Did he really do something wrong? And then the media got hold of it. The local news picked up the story first. Then the regional outlets. By the second day, national media had descended on Pike County. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran it on the front page. CNN mentioned it during their evening broadcast. Social media exploded. Twitter erupted in outrage. Reddit threads multiplied. Facebook became a digital battleground of disbelief and fury. The hashtag "Our Handcuffed Heroes" started trending. People from all over the country weighed in. This is America in 2017. We punish heroes and protect bureaucrats. Officer Brown should lose his badge. This is beyond comprehension. Imagine being arrested for saving someone's life. Welcome to the dystopia. Even law enforcement officers joined the chorus of criticism. Retired police chiefs, active duty paramedics, ER doctors, firefighters, all took to social media to express their disbelief. The consensus was universal. You never leave a critical patient. Never. Rick had done exactly what he was trained to do. What he was morally obligated to do. The Pike County Sheriff's Office issued a statement defending the arrest. It cited obstruction of roadway as a legitimate safety concern. But the statement only poured gasoline on the fire. Obstruction? While performing CPR on a dying woman? The public wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, the woman Rick had saved was beginning her long recovery. Her name was Rebecca Buchanan. 27 years old. She'd been on her way to visit her sister when a tire blowout sent her car careening off the highway. The crash had fractured 3 ribs, collapsed 1 lung, and caused severe internal bleeding. The doctors told her family that she'd come within minutes of death. Without immediate intervention, without CPR, she would have bled out at the scene. When Rebecca regained consciousness 3 days later, groggy from pain medication and surgery, a nurse told her what had happened. A stranger stopped at the crash. "He pulled you from the car. He performed CPR. He brought you back." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "What's his name?" "Rick Rickerson. I want to thank him." The nurse hesitated. "There's something you should know. He was arrested." Rebecca's confusion turned to shock as the nurse explained. The man who saved her life had been handcuffed and taken to jail for refusing to move his truck. For staying with her. For keeping her alive. "That's wrong," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "That's so wrong." As soon as she was strong enough, Rebecca gave a statement to the press. Propped up in her hospital bed, still pale and weak, she faced the cameras with tears streaming down her face. "Rick Rickerson is a hero," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He didn't leave me when I was dying. He stayed. He saved my life. And the system punished him for it." That's not justice. That's cruelty. Her words resonated across the country. The pressure on Pike County authorities intensified. But would justice prevail? Or would Rick Rickerson become another cautionary tale of good intentions crushed by bureaucratic machinery? Pike County District Attorney Benjamin Coker found himself in an impossible position. On one hand, a Georgia State Patrol officer had made an arrest based on technical grounds. On paper, Rick had refused a lawful order. The letter of the law supported the charge. On the other hand, the entire nation was watching. The optics were catastrophic. Prosecuting a hero for saving a life? It was political suicide. Coker ordered a comprehensive review of the case. His staff obtained the dashcam footage from Officer Brown's patrol car. They interviewed every witness. They consulted with paramedics who'd responded to the scene. They brought in medical experts to evaluate Rick's actions. The dashcam footage was damning, but not for Rick. The video showed everything. Rick on the ground, hands covered in blood, performing chest compressions. Officer Brown standing over him, demanding that he move his truck. Rick calmly explaining that the woman was critical, that leaving her could be fatal. Brown repeating his order, showing no concern for the dying woman at Rick's feet. The witnesses were unanimous in their support of Rick. He'd saved Rebecca's life. Without his intervention, she would have died before the helicopter arrived. The medical experts were unequivocal. Leaving a critical trauma patient unattended, even for a few minutes, substantially increased the risk of death. Rick's decision to stay was not only justified, it was the only medically and ethically sound choice he could have made. Coker reviewed the evidence for weeks. The legal standard for obstruction required proof of intent to hinder law enforcement. But Rick's intent was clear. He was trying to save a life. He wasn't obstructing justice. He was serving a higher principle, the sanctity of human life. Finally, in February 2018, 4 months after the arrest, Coker made his decision. He held a press conference at the Pike County Courthouse. Reporters packed the room. Cameras lined the walls. Rick sat in the front row with his attorney, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Coker stepped to the podium and adjusted the microphone. After a thorough and comprehensive review of all evidence in the case of the state versus Emory, Rickerson, he began, we have determined that prosecution is not in the interest of justice. The charges are hereby dismissed. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, reporters shouted questions. Rick closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, as if he'd been holding his breath for 4 months. Coker continued, raising his hand for silence. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Rickerson acted in good faith to save a human life. His actions were heroic, not criminal. While the technical grounds for obstruction may have existed, the intent required for prosecution does not. This office will not pursue charges against a man who exemplifies the best of humanity. More applause. Rick stood, shaking hands with his attorney, accepting congratulations from supporters who'd packed the courtroom. But he didn't feel celebratory. He felt exhausted. Vindicated, yes, but also deeply troubled by what the ordeal revealed about the system he'd served for 3 decades. But for Rick, legal vindication wasn't enough. He needed to meet the woman whose life had become so entangled with his own. 3 weeks after the charges were dismissed, Rick and Rebecca met face-to-face for the first time since that October afternoon. They chose a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Pike County, away from the media attention that still followed them both. Rick arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first day at the fire academy. He ordered coffee and sat at a corner table, watching the door. When Rebecca walked in, he knew her immediately, even though he'd never seen her conscious. She moved carefully, still healing from her injuries. Her eyes scanned the cafe until they found him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Rebecca crossed the room and threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder. "Thank you for not leaving me." Rick's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. He just held her, this stranger who'd become part of his life in the most unexpected way. They sat and talked for over an hour. Rebecca described what she remembered. The terror of losing control of the car, the sickening impact, then nothing until she woke up in the hospital. She didn't remember Rick's face or his voice or the feeling of his hands on her chest, pushing life back into her body. But she remembered, on some deep level, that someone had refused to let her go. "You gave me everything," she said, tears streaming down her face. "My life, my future, everything, and they punished you for it." Rick shook his head. "I'd do it again, tomorrow, the next day. Every day. That's what we do. They talked about the arrest, the media circus, the vindication. They talked about Officer Brown, who'd faced internal discipline but kept his job. They talked about the system that had failed them both. Rebecca by nearly letting her die alone. Rick by punishing him for preventing it. Before they parted, Rebecca took Rick's hand. "I'm going to tell this story for the rest of my life," she said. "People need to know what happened. They need to know that heroes are real and that sometimes the system fails them. If nothing else, your story, our story, needs to mean something," Rick nodded. "Maybe it will." In the months and years that followed, Rick's story became more than just a news item. It became a symbol. Officer Brown remained with the Georgia State Patrol, but was reassigned to desk duty. The department implemented new guidelines, emphasizing the primacy of medical emergencies over traffic enforcement. It was a small policy change, but it mattered. Rick returned to retirement, declining most media requests, but occasionally speaking at emergency services conferences. He told his story not for fame or recognition, but as a warning. The system isn't perfect. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes it punishes the very people who hold it together. But the weight of the experience stayed with him. Some nights, Rick would wake up in a cold sweat, reliving the moment the handcuffs clicked shut, not the fires he'd fought, not the collapses he'd survived. But that moment on Highway 18 when doing the right thing became a crime. His wife would find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands, the same hands that had saved hundreds of lives over 3 decades, the same hands that had been cuffed behind his back for doing exactly what they were trained to do. "You okay?" She'd ask, though she already knew the answer. "Yeah," he'd lie, just thinking. The arrest had changed something fundamental in Rick, not his willingness to help, that would never change, but his faith in the system he'd served. He'd always believed that if you did the right thing, if you followed your training and your conscience, the system would back you up. That illusion had shattered on an October afternoon in Pike County. Rebecca made a full recovery, though the road was longer and harder than anyone expected. 3 surgeries, months of physical therapy, nights when the pain was so intense she couldn't sleep. But through it all, she carried the knowledge that she was alive because a stranger had refused to abandon her. That knowledge became her anchor when the pain was unbearable, when progress felt impossible, when she wanted to give up. She returned to her job as a graphic designer, to her family, to the rhythms of normal life. But she was different now. She'd touched death and been pulled back. She'd seen the best of humanity and the worst of bureaucracy in the same afternoon. The experience marked her, changed her, made her question things she'd always taken for granted. Every October 10th, she sent Rick the same message. "Thank you for staying," and Rick always replied, "I couldn't leave," but over time, their relationship deepened beyond that simple exchange. They became friends, bound by trauma and grace. Rebecca attended Rick's granddaughter's graduation. Rick sent flowers when Rebecca got married. They spoke on the phone every few months, comparing notes on their respective PTSD, laughing about the absurdity of their shared nightmare, reminding each other that they'd both survived something that should have destroyed them. "You ever regret it?" Rebecca asked him once during one of their calls. "Stopping that day?" Rick didn't hesitate. "Never, not for a second. Even after everything? Especially after everything. Because you're here. Because you're alive. That matters more than anything else." Their story raises uncomfortable questions about the systems we trust to protect us. How many other heroes have been punished for doing the right thing? How many times has procedure trumped humanity, protocol overridden common sense? In fire academies, paramedics learn one unbreakable rule: life comes first, always. But somewhere in the translation from training to practice, that principle gets lost in paperwork and policies and parking violations. The truth is, Rick's story isn't unique. It's just the one that got caught on camera, the one that went viral, the one that couldn't be buried in bureaucratic obscurity. Across the country, every single day, first responders face impossible choices between protocol and conscience, between following orders and saving lives. Most of them choose correctly. Some of them get punished for it. The lucky ones, like Rick, eventually get vindicated. The unlucky ones carry the weight in silence. What makes Rick's case particularly haunting is its simplicity. This wasn't a complicated ethical dilemma. This wasn't a gray area of medical judgment or legal interpretation. A woman was dying. A trained professional kept her alive. And the system responded by putting him in handcuffs. If we can get something that's straightforward, so catastrophically wrong, what else are we getting wrong? What other injustices are we perpetrating in the name of order, efficiency, or procedure? These aren't abstract questions. They have names and faces. They have families and futures. Rebecca Buchanan has a name. She has a sister she was driving to visit that day. She has parents who almost had to bury their daughter. She has a husband now, children someday. None of that exists without Rick Rickerson's decision to stop, to help, to stay. And Rick, he has nightmares he'll never fully shake. He has a distrust of authority he never had before. He has a story that follows him everywhere, that defines him in ways he never wanted. But he also has something else, the absolute certainty that he did the right thing. In a world of moral ambiguity and ethical gray zones, that certainty is worth more than any commendation or award. Rick Rickerson didn't ask to become a symbol. He didn't want to be famous. He just wanted to save a life. But in doing so, he exposed a truth we'd all rather ignore. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving. Sometimes the system we depend on fails the very people who make it work. And sometimes doing the right thing comes with a cost. The handcuffs have long since been removed. The charges have been dismissed, but the questions remain. What kind of society punishes compassion? What kind of system criminalizes heroism? And most importantly, what would you do if faced with the same choice? Rick knows his answer. He's always known it. He'd do it again. Every time. Because some choices aren't really choices at all. They're simply who you are. Do you think Officer Brown should have arrested Rick? What would you have done in Rick's place? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard.